The wind moaned over the jagged limestone teeth of the forgotten mountains as the last light of day bled away, and in its place crept a cold so sharp it felt like it could strip flesh from bone, as 5 figures, bundled in thermal jackets, their faces wind-chafed and pale, stood on the crumbling lip of the earth's hidden mouth, staring into a darkness that was not merely absence of light, but a palpable thing, heavy and oppressive, ancient and unspeakably vast. Amanda, whose obsession with the uncharted depths of this particular system had driven them to this forsaken place, knelt beside the first anchor, her gloved hands shaking slightly as she double-checked the knots, the gear, the carabiners, whispering to herself under her breath, not prayers exactly, but rhythmic chants of reassurance, as though reciting these simple actions could ward off the growing, sour dread curling in her stomach. Beside her stood Greg, lean and stoop-shouldered, his breath fogging as he kept his eyes fixed on the dark horizon rather than the gaping chasm before him, and then Sean, thick-necked and jittery, flexing his hands into fists over and over again, his pupils wide and glassy, as if he could already sense the wrongness seeping from the hole. Clara, small and quiet, her lips trembling, clutched her helmet to her chest like a talisman, while Danny, the youngest, the least experienced, fumbled clumsily with his harness, fingers slipping on buckles slick with nervous sweat. They had driven 12 hours to reach this place, a stretch of wilderness so remote it didn't appear on most maps, a swath of land abandoned by civilization and swallowed by thick pine forests and craggy peaks, but what drew Amanda, and, by extension, the others, was the legend of them all. An underground labyrinth of limestone caverns so deep and unexplored that no full chart existed, only half-forgotten maps, grainy black and white photographs, and whispered stories of people who had gone in and never come out. There were tales of rescue teams finding nothing but pools of blood, mutilated gear, and once, a single boot, still laced, with the bones of the foot inside but no sign of flesh, as though the meat had simply melted away. The sun dipped lower, casting the peaks into shadow, and Amanda finally spoke, her voice brittle but resolute, "We move now. If we wait until full dark, we'll lose the light completely." One by one they descended into the opening, the thick nylon ropes creaking as they rappelled down sheer stone walls slick with moisture, the air growing colder and damper with every foot. Headlamps pierced the gloom, but only barely. The darkness swallowed their beams as though the stone itself drank the light. The first chamber they reached was enormous, a vaulted cathedral of black stone, its walls veined with mineral streaks like dried blood, the floor slick with algae and patches of something that looked disturbingly like decayed flesh. Here and there, bones, mostly animal, jutted from crevices, some snapped clean, others gnawed to splinters. Danny, breathing hard, caught up with the others and tried to steady himself. "This is insane," he muttered, but Amanda was already moving, her eyes fixed on a narrow passage half hidden behind a curtain of calcite formations that glistened in the weak light like frozen wax. As they pressed deeper, the air grew thick, not just with humidity, but with something chemical, metallic, the scent of rust and wet copper, the smell of old blood. The rock formations here twisted unnaturally, sharp spires and spirals that defied natural geometry, like growths from a diseased body rather than stone. The corridor opened into a second chamber, and in its center yawned the pit. Perfectly circular. Too perfect. The lip was smooth, polished as if by countless hands, or something worse, and from its depths rose a faint warmth, a breath of fetid air that made Clara gag and turn away. Greg knelt beside it, shining his beam downward, but the light vanished into blackness almost immediately, swallowed whole. Something moved. Not seen, but felt, a subtle vibration, a whisper of motion in the air. "No," Amanda whispered, her voice brittle with terror and awe, "no, we have to see." Before they could stop her, she was clipping in, lowering herself inch by inch into the pit, the rope hissing softly through the descender. And then, the rope jerked. Hard. Amanda's scream tore through the cavern, raw and guttural, and then, nothing. No echo. No impact. When Greg hauled the rope back, the harness was gone. The end was frayed and slick with something dark, wet. Blood. Danny stumbled back, fell, retched into the dirt. Clara sobbed. Sean swore and kicked the rock, his voice rising in blind panic. And then the sound came, soft at first, then louder. Something chewing. Wet, methodical, the snap of cartilage, the rip of sinew. They ran. But there was nowhere to run. Behind them, the shadows shifted. Pale shapes, thin, jointed wrong, fingers too long, skin slick and translucent, moved in the dark. And one by one, the cave claimed them. The darkness beyond the pit swallowed them completely, but even as they staggered through twisting tunnels slick with slime and choked with fungal growths that glowed a sickly green, the sound followed them, wet tearing, the steady, obscene rhythm of something feeding. And though their boots splashed through viscous pools that reeked of rot, though their headlamps flickered and buzzed as if the cave itself rejected illumination, they pressed on, driven by the primal terror that only those who have glimpsed true, unnatural death can understand. Sean, breathing in ragged bursts, his pulse a frantic drumbeat in his skull, clutched at Clara's sleeve as they stumbled deeper, his muttered curses dissolving into animal whimpers every time something brushed against his ankles, things slick and cold, limbs or tendrils or roots, he couldn't tell, only that they moved as if alive, as if watching. Greg led, jaw clenched, blood from Amanda's frayed rope still drying in sticky strands across his gloves, and he kept whispering her name under his breath, a broken mantra that seemed to echo unnaturally through the stone like distant laughter, warped and mocking. Danny, barely able to walk, fell twice, his palms skinned and bleeding, his breathing hoarse with panic. They came at last to a narrow fissure in the stone, barely wide enough for their bodies, and without speaking, without daring to look back, they squeezed through one by one, the rock tearing at their jackets, scraping flesh, until at last they spilled into a vast cavern lit by a sickly bioluminescent glow that seemed to come from the walls themselves. What lay before them was not nature. It could not be. The cavern's floor was slick with a glistening membrane, pulsing faintly like the hide of some enormous buried creature, and embedded in the walls were bones, human and animal, twisted together, fused into grotesque sculptures that grinned from hollow sockets. Veins, pulsing, worm-thick ropes of blood-black flesh, ran like roots through the stone, and the air shivered with the high-pitched whine of thousands of unseen insects. Clara dropped to her knees and vomited. Danny collapsed beside her, sobbing openly, while Sean stood frozen, mouth working soundlessly. Only Greg moved forward, pulled by some sick gravity toward the center of the room where something massive shifted beneath the membranous floor, something breathing. The air rippled. A soft moan, almost human, drifted through the cavern, and with it came the stink of decay so overpowering that Clara's vision blurred, her mind shrieking in protest. She clawed blindly at the others. No more, please. No more, but the floor itself opened. The thing that rose from the pit was not a creature in any form they could name. It was flesh and bone and teeth, it was a pulsing mass of mouths, of jointed limbs that bent backward, of eyes, too many eyes, blinking wetly in grotesque patterns. It spoke in voices they recognized, Amanda's scream, her last breath twisted into something obscene. And then it moved. What followed was not death, not immediately. But disassembly, the slow, deliberate undoing of the human form. The creature's limbs, slick, jointed appendages ending in glistening claws, descended on Sean first, lifting him as easily as a child lifts a rag doll, and without ceremony, it peeled him, stripping muscle from bone and wet, slapping sheets. His screams were muffled almost immediately as the thing's smaller mouths, needle-toothed and lipless, suckled at his face, devouring flesh by the mouthful until only blood-slick bone remained, his jaw working in grotesque mimicry long after life had fled. Greg tried to pull Clara back, tried to move her, but her legs gave out, her eyes fixed on Sean's ruin. The sound, the sickening sound, would never leave her, the wet pulling, the snap of tendons, the crunch of gristle. Danny screamed and screamed until his voice broke, until the creature's many eyes turned toward him, and then another limb darted forward, fast as a striking snake, and Danny's head burst in a red blossom of bone and meat, his body dropping like a marionette with its strings cut. The walls pulsed. The floor throbbed. Greg dragged Clara through another passageway, this one slick with bile, the walls soft under their hands as though they crawled through the inside of some titanic digestive tract. And all the while the creatures' voices followed, distorted echoes of their own words, fragments of Amanda's last scream, laughter that was not laughter but the sound of flesh being torn. They ran until they could not run. They collapsed in a narrow tunnel, lungs burning, hearts near rupture, and in the darkness they clung to one another, shivering, silent tears tracing through the grime on their cheeks. Greg found a small alcove, barely large enough for their bodies, and there they huddled as the cave moaned and shifted around them, as distant chewing echoed through the stone. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time unraveled in that place. And then the whispering began. Amanda's voice. "Help me." Soft. "Close." Impossible. Greg rose, numb and broken, and followed. The corridor narrowed until Greg had to crawl on hands and knees, the rock slick with something dark, his palms raw and bleeding. Behind him, Clara sobbed quietly, her mind shattered, her voice gone. The whispering grew louder. Amanda's voice, clearer now, calling his name in a child's broken lilt, "Greg, please. I'm so cold." He emerged at last into a chamber unlike the others, smooth, spherical, its walls a living membrane shot through with veins that pulsed with sluggish black ichor. In the center lay Amanda, or what remained of her. She was fused to the floor, her torso and limbs melted into the pulsing flesh, only her face recognizable, stretched and tear-streaked, her eyes wide and glistening with something that wasn't human sanity. "Help me," she rasped, her mouth barely able to move. Greg stumbled forward, dry heaving, tears pouring unchecked. "I'm here, Amanda, I'm..." But her mouth twisted into an awful grin, and from her split torso something massive and wet and slick with afterbirth erupted, something with too many limbs, too many jaws, its skin a glistening mirror of the cave's own meat. Amanda's body split like rotten fruit, her ribs snapping wide as the thing birthed itself in wet spasms. Greg screamed but could not move. The thing, newborn and hideous, opened its eyes, Amanda's eyes. And it spoke in her voice. Clara's mind cracked first. She knelt in the filth, rocking, her eyes fixed on some distant vision, her hands clawing at her own face as the whispers filled her skull, Greg's screams, Amanda's voice, the chewing sounds, the endless wet tearing of flesh. Greg, broken beyond language, stumbled through the tunnels blind, his hands bloodied stumps from scraping at stone, his breath rattling as his mind folded in on itself. The cave pulsed and moved around him. The walls shifted, new passages opening, closing, swallowing him. He found himself back at the original pit, the perfect circle, now ringed with bodies, stripped to bone, their skulls arranged in obscene patterns, their empty sockets turned inward as though watching. The thing waited. It had always waited. He stepped forward without resistance as tendrils slithered from the dark, coiling around his limbs, lifting him gently toward the yawning maw that split the earth. The last thing he saw, before the dark swallowed him, was Amanda's face, impossibly huge, impossibly distant, smiling from the flesh of the cave itself, her empty eyes glowing faintly. And then there was only darkness. And the sound of chewing. Forever.